So some of you guys are probably already looking forward, like I am most Sundays, to what lunch will be. I love going out for Sunday lunch after the sermon, after the service. And a big reason, I'm not going to lie, is the food. But another reason is that I love going out to eat with people and who I get to sit across from. And one of the people that I've got to sit across from often is this guy named Brian. Brian used to be in the youth group. He graduated, and then I actually got to know him a lot better after graduation. We started hanging out, going out to eat, and it was interesting because I could very much tell Brian was not necessarily into his the whole faith thing anymore. He had kind of slipped away, but he kind of brought it up every now and then, and I would try to move him toward that conversation. And then there was one time when we went out to eat, and he just really opened up about his faith and what that looked like. And he basically said, yeah, I haven't been doing well. I've been slipping away from God. There's things that I've done that I kind of regret, and I'm kind of trying to figure out what to do now. And basically what Brian was asking me is, how do I get back into a right relationship with God? And there's this moment, and I remember just sitting there in that moment thinking, oh, what do I say? Like, he wants to hear about what this looks like, but what is the right thing to tell Brian in this moment? And as I thought about it, I thought, man, I can tell him, ask forgiveness, but I want something more tangible. So what do I do? And maybe some of you guys have been in my shoes before, and you've been sitting across from somebody who wants to hear, man, how do I get back into a good relationship with God? Or maybe more likely, and I know this is true for me too, that you and I too have been sitting in Brian's shoes, that we realize I've drifted, I've fallen away from God, maybe in a big area, maybe in just something small, and I want to get back. And how do I do that? Well, this isn't a new issue. This isn't an issue that just people who leave high school and are headed toward college have in that transition. It's not an issue that just Americans have. It's not just an issue that we have in the 21st century. But this is an issue that Christians have had since the very beginning, since the very first Christians were around. And there's this guy named James. And James actually wrote a letter to some of the very first Christians in the first century and said, hey, I know about some of the stuff that's been happening, and I can see that some of you have been slipping away, and let me tell you about how to get back into a right relationship with God. Now, like I said, James was around in the first century. He actually knew Jesus. In fact, it's likely that this guy James, he wrote this book of the Bible called, it's not too hard to remember, James. And James was probably, it's most likely that he was the brother of Jesus. So he knew who Jesus was pretty well, had seen him as he grew up. And James, most of his book is about how we should behave. And it's written to these Christians in the first century who are scattered around the Roman Empire. And James is very, emphasizes a lot, how do you live out your faith? How do you turn your faith into action? And in this specific spot that we're going to read tonight, it's in James 4, verses 7 through 10. James is addressing Christians who are not acting like Christians. In fact, it says that they're kind of quarreling amongst themselves, they're not getting along. And James is going to give them some direction on what to do next. And he says, the reason that you're not getting along is because you're not getting along with God. And once James helps them kind of realize this point that they've strayed from God, once they're at the same place that Brian was at, sitting across the table from me, James says, all right, here's what you need to do next. This is what I should have told Brian, probably. And maybe what you might need to hear today, and certainly when I think about how do I come back to God, something I need to hear too. So this is in James 4, verses 7 through 10. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there. James 4, verses 7 through 10. Let's read together. James 4, starting at verse 7. So, humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. So there's two parts, I think, to what James says. First thing James says are things that you should do, and the second part is things that God will do. And I want to take most of the time today to think about the things you will do, and then we'll talk a little bit about what God will do in response to. There's four ways. I think the big thing that James talks about is that we need to come clean with God. We need to come clean with God so we're back in a right relationship with him. And there's four things I think he points at in this passage. Let's talk about each one. So the first thing is, come clean by submitting to God. James says at the very beginning, submit yourselves to God. And at the end, he says, humble yourselves before God. And both kind of have the same feel of making yourself subject to God. When I think of what it means to submit, I think of college. I think of going to Northwestern College here in Roseville, and that I got to sign this thing that if you went to Christian college, you're probably familiar with. It's called a lifestyle statement. And I remember people complaining about the lifestyle statement, being like, come on, how are we going to learn to live in the real world if we can't do this stuff now? And I think they may have made some valid points, but I always thought, really, don't you realize that when you signed up for college, when you said, yeah, I want to go to Northwestern or Bethel or wherever you went to college, you signed this thing that said, yeah, I'm cool with not smoking or drinking or gambling or this whole list of other things. I agree to that. I will submit myself to that. Now, I don't care, you could have maybe even gone to a college that signed a lifestyle statement that says you have to ride unicycles around all the time while you're wearing hot pink and trumpeting like elephants. That's crazy. I probably wouldn't go to that college, but if you went to that college and you signed that lifestyle statement, you are submitting yourself to that. And so I think when we choose to submit to something, then we need to follow that submission. And one of the things about going to Northwestern is that I felt good about signing that statement because I had trust that Northwestern had my best interest and the community's best interest at heart. And the same is true with God in many ways. Just like I chose to submit myself to Northwestern, to submit myself to their expectations because I trusted they had my best interest at heart, I can choose to submit myself to God as well. When James says, be subject to Jesus, he's inviting his audience to come under God's rule. And we need to weigh our options here because we have choices about where we submit ourselves to. We might subject ourselves to what others think. We might submit ourselves to our drive for more money or more power or more fame. There's a lot of things we can subject ourselves to. And I think it's true that we all subject ourselves, we all submit to something. And in this life, I don't think there's a time where we don't submit ourselves to something. I think in life, we will become subject to something. And if we don't choose what that thing is, that thing will probably choose us. And so we can choose Jesus to submit ourselves to and trust that God has our best interests at heart and that God loves us. So who will you choose to submit to? You can come clean with God by submitting to God, by being humble before God. The second thing is come clean by resisting the devil. James says it pretty straightforwardly, resist the devil. Now I think we can make very broad implications about this. I think we could make it complicated and very theological, but I think that's not necessary. I think it's pretty straightforward. When Jesus describes the devil, here's how he describes the devil. In John 8:44, he says, he was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. In case you didn't get it, the devil has something to do with lying, the father of lies. And following the devil means buying into those lies. And when I think about what lies we might be believing or what lies I might be believing, I think maybe they're greedy lies. That a little more will make me happy. Or unity-crushing lies that I don't need everyone else. I'm fine on my own, and everyone's against me. Or prideful lies that says, I'm good enough. I'm better than you. Or self-defeating lies that say, it can't be possible that anybody can possibly love me. Or selfish lies that make me forget about the needs of others. We can buy into all sorts of lies. It's possible we might wonder, man, how do I identify what's a lie and what's not? I think a simple answer is that we seek God's truth. And we can find God's truth in the Bible. We can find God's truth in people who are spiritually mature and wise, in community. But we can seek God's truth and then be responsible for the truth that we have. Be responsible for the truth that you know. The devil is the father of lies, and if we want to come clean with God, we need to resist the devil. Not saunter away or watch from a distance, but actively resist the devil. Take the option of sin off the table. If your issue is stealing, don't go to the store by yourself. If your issue is lying, get someone to talk with you about it every day and ask you good questions about it. If your issue is going too far with a significant other, don't put yourself in those places where that could happen. If your issue is pornography, get rid of your computer, or at least put it in a different room. Whatever it is, resist the devil. And then check out what James says after that. He says, if you resist the devil will flee. It's kind of encouraging, right? We resist, the devil will flee. So the first thing is, come clean by submitting to God. The second thing is, come clean by resisting the devil. And that second one is about temptation, the temptation of sin. But let's talk about sin itself, and that's the third one. Come clean by purifying yourself from sin. Growing up, maybe some of you can relate. Did you ever get dirty, rolling in mud or playing in the mud and want to come home and then go inside immediately? I certainly did. The house I grew up in had a swamp behind our house, and my brother and I thought it was a pretty cool idea and kind of neat to go walking around in the swamp with our boots. One of my first memories is standing in the swamp, and I was way too young to be walking around down in the muck by myself. But I remember sticking my boot way in the mud and then trying to pull it out, and I couldn't. And I remember just kind of sliding my foot out and then going back to the house with one less boot. And I was filthy, and I was usually dirty, but we knew, my brother and I knew, we needed to go find the hose before we go inside, because my mother would not be letting us inside with all that mud on us. Sin is like that mud. God wants us to be clean of mud before we enter into a right relationship with Him. James said, wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. James is moving on from just addressing the resisting of temptation to dealing with what sin you've committed. But our garden hose, our path to cleanliness, is not something that we do, but it's something that God does for us, that Christ did on the cross. So coming clean with God means seeking Christ's forgiveness. And the last one, come clean by mourning the effects of sin. We've talked about temptation, we've talked about dealing with sin, but let's talk about the effects of sin. James says, grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. It's pretty heavy-handed. I don't know how many of us realize we messed up somehow, we sinned, and we say, I'm sorry, God, and then for the next 24 hours we pretend we're at a funeral and we look very sad-faced and we wear black. I don't think that happens. It seems a little over the top. But I think James is saying this to those people then, and I think it translates to us now, because we have a hard time seeing the ugliness of sin. We don't think about the full effects of our sin. When we sin, it's kind of like we're planting little mines everywhere, little sin mines. And some of them you immediately step on and it blows up and it hurts you. Because sin does hurt you. It pulls you away from God. Or maybe there's the sin mine we plant and we forget about it. And then next week or next month or next year or 20 years from now, it can still affect us and it can still hurt us. Sometimes something we did long ago comes back as a problem in our life. And often, we're not the only ones it hurts. Very often, it's going to hurt someone else too. The sin mines we plant blow up and hurt other people as well. When those words that we said hurt someone and stick with someone, or when a selfish decision causes pain for someone else, maybe down the road, maybe something you never even actually know about, but sin hurts people. In fact, today we're still stepping on these mines that were planted years and years ago, mines called sexism and racism and abuse. And they're hurting us today because of decisions that were made lifetimes ago and generations ago and centuries ago still impact us today because sin hurts people. And we forget too easily that all of our sin, every mine we plant, always hurts God. Because Jesus died as a result of our sin. Our sin killed our Savior. And so I think it's right that James says, mourn, weep, wail. Because that is the most appropriate response for what our sin does. Part of coming clean with God is pausing to recognize the ugliness of our own sin and taking time to mourn that sin. So there's 4 things. Come clean by submitting to God. Come clean by resisting the devil. Come clean by purifying yourself from sin. And come clean by mourning the effects of sin. Now I'd invite you guys to pick one thing in your life that you feel, this is something I need to come clean with before God. Where have you messed up or ignored God? What does it mean for you to submit to God with that thing? With that thing, what would resisting the devil look like? And how do you need to seek God's forgiveness and to find purity in that issue? And how do you need to really more fully understand the ugliness of that sin issue and mourn its effects? So right now, I want you to take just a moment and quietly talk with God about that thing. And say to God, this is one thing that I need to come clean with you about. So go ahead and take that time right now. At the beginning, I pointed out that there were 2 things that James talked about. Things that we do and things that God does. We've talked about the things that we need to do to come clean with God. There's also a result of these actions. I'm going to read this passage one more time. And as you listen, I want you to listen for those results. Listen for the things that God does in response to us. So humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. God comes near, and God lifts us up. Although we wallow in the ugliness of sin, when we are humble before God and seek God's forgiveness, God lifts us up out of that sin. God doesn't leave us hanging. God comes near and brings us into a restored relationship with him. Together, we can come clean before God by submitting to God, by resisting the devil, by seeking purity, and by mourning the effects of sin. And we can know that we don't just do these things without a reaction from God. God doesn't stay silent. Because when we come clean with God, God comes near to us. When we come clean with God, God comes near to us.